Darkness draped across Nuevo Laredo like a warning. The city was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that brings peace. It was the kind of silence that presses against your chest, that makes you breathe slower, that tells you something is coming. Midnight had passed, and the streets looked almost deserted. But the people who lived here knew better. They knew when the bars closed early. They knew when the music shut off suddenly. They knew when headlights in the distance weren't just a neighbor coming home. In the shadows, trucks rolled slow. Engines idled with deliberate weight. Men climbed down, faces hidden by ski masks, rifles glinting under weak street lamps. This wasn't random movement, it was choreography. And everyone who saw it knew exactly what it meant. For weeks, rumors had been building. A neighbor vanished, a businessman never came home, a family closed shop and fled overnight. People whispered about bodies left hanging from bridges. About grenade attacks on crowded neighborhoods. About nightclubs set ablaze as warnings. Authorities denied it. But denial doesn't drown out fear. Nuevo Laredo was a city on edge. Every sound became a signal. Every rumor felt like prophecy. And in the middle of those whispers was one name, Los Zetas. Born from elite military deserters, they were trained like soldiers but unleashed as predators. They used fear not as a byproduct, but as a weapon. They didn't just control territory. They controlled imagination. They convinced people that resistance wasn't just dangerous, it was impossible. And then there was a man whose name still stirs fear when whispered, Miguel Trevino Morales, known as Z40. He wasn't raised in distant mountains or remote jungles. He grew up right here, in Nuevo Laredo. His roots were the city's roots. His family walked its streets. His power came not from distance, but from familiarity. So when the engines grew louder that night, when residents peeked from behind curtains and saw convoys crossing intersections, they understood, this wasn't just noise. This was takeover. At 2:17 a.m., the silence shattered. A single shot cracked through the sky. Then another. Then a storm of gunfire. A police outpost, once a symbol of authority, collapsed into chaos. Radios screamed, sirens wailed, but response was too slow. The first domino had fallen. Inside their homes, families woke in terror. Children pressed against the walls as the floor shook from explosions. Mothers pulled their sons and daughters into dark corners, whispering prayers. Fathers locked gates, praying that the darkness outside wouldn't find its way in. The bridges, arteries of the city, gateways to the United States, suddenly became contested ground. Whoever held the bridges held the future. Los Zetas understood that, and they moved with precision. Soldiers of fear advancing like clockwork, cutting the city into pieces. And as dawn loomed, one thought haunted every survivor in Nuevo Laredo: if this is how the night begins, how does it end?
You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story.
Nuevo Laredo is more than just a dot on the map. It is a pulse point, a place where two worlds collide across a single river. By day, the city is alive with trucks and commerce, with street vendors calling out their prices and families crossing bridges to visit cousins, to shop, to work. By night, however, the same streets transform. The hum of commerce fades and something else rises, the low, unshakable awareness that this city is not merely a crossing point, but a contested prize. It has been this way for decades, a jewel of geography claimed and reclaimed by forces larger than any one family. Because of its location, hugging the Rio Bravo, staring across at Laredo, Texas, Nuevo Laredo is not just a border city, it is a funnel. It is one of the busiest commercial gateways between Mexico and the United States, where billions of dollars worth of goods cross each year. Every truck, every container, every piece of cargo that rolls across that bridge represents opportunity. And where there is opportunity in this region, there is competition. Smugglers have known this since the earliest days, and cartels have built empires upon it. Whoever controls Nuevo Laredo controls a major artery into the United States. Whoever controls Nuevo Laredo controls more than money, they control leverage. But Nuevo Laredo was never just defined by trade. It was defined by its vulnerability. Families here grew up knowing that power shifted often. In the 1990s, the Gulf Cartel began to cement its hold, weaving through politics, law enforcement, and commerce like a parasite so deeply buried it was hard to tell where government ended and cartel began. For a time, their rule was brutal, but stable. Yet stability is always temporary in a world where profit breeds rivals. Out of the Gulf Cartel's very own bodyguards came a force unlike anything the region had seen before. They called themselves Los Zetas. Los Zetas did not emerge like other groups. They were not simply street toughs or opportunistic traffickers. They were men trained by the Mexican military, some even schooled by U.S. forces at Fort Bragg, taught the mechanics of warfare. They were soldiers who turned their skills inward, abandoning the flag to pledge allegiance to profit. And with them came tactics that stunned rivals and terrified communities: coordinated ambushes, public executions, use of military weapons, and psychological warfare designed to make an entire city obey without question. The Zetas understood something fundamental: fear was currency, and they intended to flood the market. They didn't just remove rivals quietly, they staged violence publicly. Bodies hung from bridges in daylight, heads left outside police stations, entire neighborhoods awakened by the sound of grenades. It wasn't simply killing, it was messaging. And that message was clear: resistance equals death. Collaboration equals survival. Silence equals safety, at least temporarily. By the early 2000s, Los Zetas had shifted from being enforcers for the Gulf Cartel to a cartel in their own right. The relationship fractured violently, leaving Nuevo Laredo in the center of a storm. This city, already worn by years of corruption, suddenly found itself torn between two masters. On one side, the remnants of the Gulf Cartel, clinging desperately to its long-standing hold. On the other, the rising force of Los Zetas, eager to prove that their reign would be more absolute, more terrifying, and more profitable than anything before it. The battle lines weren't drawn in faraway jungles or remote deserts, they were drawn in neighborhoods, in school districts, in the very markets where families bought tortillas and bread. Gunfire erupted near playgrounds. Convoys thundered past houses. And the most devastating weapon wasn't always the bullets, it was the silence imposed upon an entire population. Journalists, threatened with death, stopped reporting. Citizens learned to look away. Entire families vanished from dinner tables and reappeared only as whispers of tragedy. For many in Nuevo Laredo, survival became a simple equation: don't speak, don't ask, don't notice. Entire newspapers left their front pages blank rather than risk retaliation. Radio stations ignored explosions and shootings. Authorities, either compromised or terrified, offered little comfort. And through that silence, Los Zetas grew stronger, feeding on the very fear they created, embedding themselves so deeply into the city's rhythm that to live in Nuevo Laredo was to live with their shadow over your shoulder. But what made Nuevo Laredo so valuable also made it vulnerable. The same bridges that carried legitimate goods carried illicit cargo. Every road that led into the city was a potential lifeline for smuggling. And so, battles weren't just for streets or neighborhoods, they were for entire trade routes. For control of highways leading to Monterey. For rail lines disappearing into the U.S. For access to corridors where millions of dollars flowed unseen every day. Nuevo Laredo wasn't just a city. It was a chessboard, and every piece on it, from police chiefs to small business owners, was in play. By the mid-2000s, the tension was unbearable. The Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas were no longer allies. They were enemies in a war where the battlefield was a city of more than 500,000 souls. Every night, families went to sleep knowing they could wake to a new rule, a new face demanding loyalty. And in that fragile environment, a single night would soon come to represent the breaking point, the night when Los Zetas decided Nuevo Laredo would belong to them, no matter the cost. the night did not begin with an explosion. It began with whispers. In Nuevo Laredo, whispers traveled faster than any radio signal, passed quietly between market stalls and across kitchen tables. People said strange convoys had been seen rolling down the highways, headlights off, armored trucks painted in black. Others swore they saw men in tactical gear stopping vehicles at makeshift checkpoints. No one knew exactly when it would happen, but everyone sensed something was coming. That anticipation, the weight of the unknown, was sometimes worse than the violence itself. By nightfall, the city's main avenues were crawling with shadows. Witnesses later described long processions of SUVs, some with their license plates removed, others spray-painted with crude symbols. Men leaned from the windows with rifles slung across their chests. To the untrained eye, they looked like soldiers on patrol. But these were not government forces, these were Los Zetas, moving with military precision through the heart of a civilian city. Every intersection they passed became theirs. Every light that turned red was ignored. And with each passing block, the city's breath grew shorter, as if it, too, were choking on fear. The first shots rang out near a police substation. Not random bursts, but carefully aimed volleys. Glass shattered, sirens wailed, and within minutes the building was abandoned. Officers fled into the darkness, some without even grabbing their weapons, others pretending to have been overwhelmed, secretly grateful for the excuse not to fight. For years, the line between law enforcement and organized crime had blurred. Tonight, that line snapped entirely. Nuevo Laredo no longer had a functioning police force. In less than an hour, the streets belonged to Los Zetas. As the assault spread, families locked their doors and pressed against the floors, praying the chaos outside would pass them by. But even behind locked doors, there was no true safety. The Zetas did not just want control of buildings, they wanted control of perception. Grenades were hurled into the night, exploding at intersections where no rivals stood, solely to send a message. Rapid bursts of gunfire erupted on empty streets, an auditory reminder that no one should even think of stepping outside. Fear was no longer a consequence of violence, fear was the strategy. By midnight, key choke points across the city had been sealed. Bridges, roundabouts, and intersections were manned by armed sentries. Some carried radios, relaying updates as if they were a disciplined military unit. And in truth, that was exactly what they were, a cartel that had studied the art of occupation. Residents who attempted to drive through checkpoints were ordered out of their cars, forced to stand against walls while masked men inspected their trunks. Some vehicles were seized outright, converted instantly into tools of war. No warrant, no paperwork, just the raw weight of intimidation. Meanwhile, on the American side of the border, lights burned brightly in Laredo, Texas. From across the river, residents could hear faint echoes of gunfire. The two cities, separated only by a stretch of water and steel, felt worlds apart that night. In Laredo, people walked their dogs under streetlights. In Nuevo Laredo, families crouched under their tables, whispering prayers. The contrast was brutal, like watching a neighbor's house engulfed in flames while your own living room remained intact. And yet, everyone knew the fire was close enough to spread. The longer the night stretched, the bolder the Zetas became. They targeted safe houses, businesses rumored to have supported rivals, even nightclubs where off-duty police officers were known to gather. Explosions lit up the skyline, and with each blast came new screams, new chaos. For the people of Nuevo Laredo, it was impossible to tell where the next wave would fall. Some areas fell silent only to erupt again hours later. Others remained untouched, a deliberate tactic to keep the population guessing, to prove that safety could never be guaranteed. Somewhere in the chaos, messages were sent, cryptic banners unfurled across bridges, spray-painted threats left on walls. The Zetas were not only seizing ground but seizing the narrative. They declared themselves the new order, mocking their rivals and daring the government to respond. Every banner, every spray-painted word was a reminder that this was more than a battle for a city. It was a declaration of sovereignty. For one night, Nuevo Laredo was not governed by Mexico. It was governed by fear wearing a black mask and carrying a rifle. As the clock crept toward dawn, the violence did not fade, it transformed. The firefights slowed, but a heavy silence blanketed the city. It was the kind of silence that comes only after too much screaming, too much shooting, when the city itself seems exhausted. People began to emerge cautiously from hiding, only to see military-style trucks parked in plazas, masked men smoking casually on street corners, as if they had always been there. Nuevo Laredo was no longer bracing for an attack. The attack was over. The occupation had begun. By sunrise, the city looked unrecognizable. Streets once filled with vendors were deserted, shop shutters riddled with bullet holes. Burned cars smoldered at intersections. Stray dogs sniffed cautiously around abandoned shoes and shattered glass. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. For those who lived through it, the night would be remembered not for any single explosion, but for the collective realization that Los Zetas had transformed Nuevo Laredo into something more than a battleground. It was now their territory. And as the first rays of sunlight struck the rooftops, the question was no longer if they had taken over, but how long the world would let it last. When the first light of morning broke over Nuevo Laredo, it did not bring relief. It brought revelation. The smoke was still rising, drifting lazily over rooftops as if reluctant to leave. Families emerged cautiously from their homes, some clutching rosaries, others clutching nothing at all, because everything they owned had already been taken. The streets were littered with burned-out vehicles, fragments of glass, and shell casings that glinted in the pale dawn. Mothers carried children across intersections still stained with blood. Shopkeepers unlocked their doors only to find their businesses riddled with bullet holes, the night's violence etched permanently into their walls. The official numbers were almost immediate, but they were lies. Authorities spoke of isolated incidents and minimal casualties. But on the ground, the whispers told a different story. Families counted their dead in private, passing names on scraps of paper, whispering prayers in hushed tones. Entire blocks had been silenced, not just by bullets but by the knowledge that speaking out could cost you your life. In this city, truth itself had become contraband, smuggled carefully from house to house, hidden beneath the weight of official denial. For the survivors, the aftermath was not measured in bodies but in absence. Fathers who never returned from night shifts. Sons who left to meet friends and were swallowed by the darkness. Daughters who hid under beds until the gunfire stopped, only to find that their neighbors had vanished. These were not statistics, they were ruptures in the fabric of the city. And the city carried them in silence. In living rooms, mothers placed plates at dinner tables for children who would never return. On street corners, shoes were left scattered, never claimed. Absence became the city's heaviest presence. The government's response came too late, and too weak. Convoys of soldiers rolled into Nuevo Laredo days after the fact, their uniforms crisp, their rifles polished, their faces unreadable. They patrolled the same streets that Los Zetas had already claimed, but for the residents, it was a hollow theater. Everyone knew the truth, the soldiers had not come to reclaim the city. They had come to be seen. Their presence was performance, not protection. And behind closed doors, rumors spread that some of those soldiers had been on the streets already, only under different orders, wearing different masks. In Washington, officials spoke of concern. In Mexico City, politicians made promises. But for the people who lived in Nuevo Laredo, promises were worthless. They had seen too many of them break. Every year, funds poured into anti-cartel efforts. Every year, the violence escalated. What mattered wasn't what politicians said on podiums, it was who controlled the checkpoints, who collected the taxes in the markets, who answered the phone when families received ransom demands. And in Nuevo Laredo, the answer was no longer the state. It was Los Zetas. The press, once the voice of the people, fell silent. Journalists who dared to ask questions were met with death threats. Some disappeared altogether, their stories left unfinished in half-written notebooks. Local radio stations refused to mention the attacks, instead playing music as if nothing had happened. Entire newspapers left front pages blank, a stark monument to the cost of speaking. Silence became survival, and in that silence, the truth dissolved. The night Los Zetas took Nuevo Laredo was not just a massacre of bodies, it was a massacre of words. But the greatest toll was not political, and it was not even numerical. It was psychological. For every family who buried a son, there were 10 more who lived in dread that their turn would come next. Children no longer slept through the night, every car backfiring became a grenade, every knock on the door a death sentence. Teachers struggled to keep classrooms calm as students whispered about the sounds they had heard after midnight. Entire neighborhoods built invisible routines around violence, avoiding certain streets, ducking at the sound of engines, leaving shoes by the door in case they had to run. Fear was not an occasional visitor in Nuevo Laredo. It had taken up permanent residence. And yet, in the shadow of that fear, resilience persisted. Some families opened their homes to the displaced, offering food to strangers. Churches held vigils with candles flickering in the darkness, their hymns trembling but unbroken. Mothers formed quiet networks, sharing information, warning one another of danger. Journalists, in secret, traded files across encrypted channels, determined to preserve the truth even if it could not yet be printed. Hope was not loud in Nuevo Laredo, it whispered, fragile and fleeting. But it survived. In the years that followed, the night became legend. Children who were too young to remember it grew up hearing stories whispered at family gatherings. That was the night everything changed, their parents said. It became a marker in time, the line between before and after. Before, Nuevo Laredo was a city at risk. After, it was a city under occupation. And though governments would later claim victories, though cartels would fracture and leaders would fall, the memory of that night remained untouchable. It was etched into the city's identity, as permanent as the scars in its streets. And so, when we speak of Nuevo Laredo today, we do not simply speak of geography. We speak of a city that learned what it meant to live under siege. We speak of families who endured silence, of journalists who paid with their lives, of soldiers who blurred the line between state and shadow. We speak of the night Los Zetas took over, not as a chapter in history, but as a wound still open, still bleeding into the present. Because in cities like Nuevo Laredo, the past is never past. It waits, quietly, like a whisper before the next storm. The night that Los Zetas took over Nuevo Laredo did not end with sunrise. It ended with a city forever changed, with a population whose lives had been rewritten in the language of fear. Streets that once bustled with commerce and laughter now carried silence like a second skin. Mothers walked quietly, listening for sounds that might never be explained. Fathers carried invisible burdens heavier than any weapon. Children, who had once chased balls in open courtyards, now played in shadows, careful not to be seen. That night became more than memory, it became a blueprint, etched into the very rhythm of the city. Time passed, but the scars remained. Buildings repaired themselves physically, but the emotional wounds lingered. Residents still remembered the echoes of gunfire bouncing off concrete walls. They remembered the smell of smoke and the taste of fear. And they remembered, most vividly, the uncertainty, the knowledge that one night could erase everything, that no life, no family, no business, was ever truly safe again. This was not just a story of violence. It was a story of power, power exerted not through law or governance, but through terror and spectacle. Outside the city, the world continued. Borders remained, commerce flowed, governments spoke in polite terms of concern. But within Nuevo Laredo, life had adapted to a new normal. Curfews were informal but strictly observed. Certain streets were avoided entirely. Informants and collaborators moved discreetly through the alleys, passing information like whispers on the wind. It was a city where survival depended less on courage and more on understanding the subtle grammar of fear. Every glance, every door left unlocked or locked, every choice was a negotiation with shadows. And yet, amidst the darkness, resilience persisted. Families rebuilt, children went to school, small businesses reopened under careful scrutiny, and those who survived learned to find small victories in everyday life. In quiet corners of the city, people whispered stories of courage, neighbors protecting neighbors, mothers forming chains of support, journalists secretly documenting the truth even when the cameras could not. These moments of human defiance did not erase the trauma, but they illuminated the tenacity of a population that refused to disappear, that refused to be fully silenced. Today, Nuevo Laredo stands as a testament to endurance, a city marked by both terror and survival. It is a place where the past refuses to settle quietly. The night Los Zetas took over is no longer simply an event in history, it is a cautionary tale, a reminder of what can happen when violence meets opportunity and governance falters. The echoes of that night still ripple through the streets, through the memories of those who lived it, through the silent warnings written into the routines of daily life. And as long as fear and ambition coexist, the shadow of that night will never fully lift. Because in cities like Nuevo Laredo, the night is never truly over. The stories of terror and survival linger in whispers, in shadows, in the heartbeat of every street. And for those who lived it, and those who will hear of it, the night Los Zetas took over is not just history, it is a warning, a testament, and an echo that refuses to fade.